We're going to welcome in John Singleton. He is the founder of the program, and he has been in the space coaching CrossFit athletes for over a decade now. So you're very familiar with our European field, John.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Always great to catch up with you. And on the heels of the Open is over, we are now approaching quarterfinals. What are just some of your initial thoughts when you see some of these European athletes at the top of the leaderboard? I mean, first Jonakowski, but within the top 10, top 20, so many names from Europe.
You know, we've been drumming it home for a few years, the Europe is coming idea. Um, we we have been a dominant region for a long time, so it's no surprise, I think, to see new faces and new names coming up on that leaderboard as well.
Who do you think the leaders of the men's field are right now in Europe?
So I actually think that question depends a little. It's so stacked that it depends a
Mhm.
little on the programming that gets put into place. And I think this is where the leaderboard can really fluctuate around. We had some athletes last year who qualified with a certain type of programming, and I think if that programming gets shifted a bit, we'd see a whole, some more fresh faces in there with those slight and subtle changes.
When we look at Europe as a whole, we mentioned that you've been in the space for over a decade now, but some of the OGs, I think specifically of BKG, for he's always in the mix. It doesn't really matter. But is there this changing of the guard that everybody talks about in Europe where the old guys are still in charge? Or are we at the point where there is this shift that new names are starting or should be starting to rise above?
Yeah, I think so. I think a decade in the sport is impressive, especially in CrossFit. And Yanni's going for his 10th year this year as well. For example, with Björgren, for example, he's been in the sport for a decade. He's now in his early 30s. And now we're starting to see people come through in their early 20s. And that's obviously like a big difference age wise as well. And the thing with a sports career, it's a lot shorter than your typical career.
What about the women's field? Who are some female athletes that you're really keeping your eye on this season?
So Miriam, who she obviously won the Open, um,
Yeah.
but she's been a bit of an interesting athlete. She's very off the radar until last week, basically, or when it got announced that she won. Um, so it'd be very interesting to see if she's able to like put herself. I believe she's only 22 years old as well.
Mhm.
And an athlete that hasn't really competed that much in CrossFit. So no one really knows that much about her. She's obviously done more in high rocks than she had in CrossFit. But I know that she's been focused a lot more on this year's CrossFit season. So it'd be interesting to see if she's able to break through to even getting to the games this year.
Is she somebody that you think once those heavier barbells come into play, higher skill gymnastics, that she like has had enough time to build some of those the strengths with the skills and the weights to hang with the rest of these European women?
Yeah, she's pretty strong. Certain lifts. She's competed in Olympic weightlifting. I think there's some stuff with the gymnastics, especially like with complex gymnastics, like ring muscle ups, whatever that may be, that might become more of an issue. But she definitely has the foundations in order to be at a game stage.
And when we talk about, other athletes that might be off our radars that we should be paying attention to as we head into quarterfinals and semifinals, who are those names that come to the top of mind?
So I think one thing that's interesting on the guys' side is you now have a lot of athletes who are current games athletes who are past games athletes. So before the call, you have to do this now, like when talking about qualifying athletes for the games, because you're getting like 12 athletes qualify through. And, you start to list out this list, and I've got this list in front of me with over 20 names that I legitimately think could take those places.
Who are they?
So even if we take this year's games, you've got like Lazar, BKG, Henrik Moritz, Jelle Jonne, all this David Shrunky, Bronislav, Michael, and Fabi.
Mhm.
Then just behind those guys, you've got like Colin, for example, another young face who could be coming through. He's very good at conditioning, very good at gymnastics. Maybe the strength becomes a bit of an issue, but again, very close last year, could get through. You've got then someone like Victor Hoffer, who, he's
Mm.
obviously now with one of the American training camps. That brings a lot of more exposure to him. Very close at qualifying last year, super young. It'd be good money to think, just with that age, being that good at a young age, that he's going to progress through, and the next step is going to be the games. We've also got Luka Vunjak, who has been very close a couple of years, just on the fringe, hasn't had as much exposure as the other athletes, but could be there. And then, you've got Guillaume from France, who has qualified through. You've got Luca, you've got Georgos Karavis, Adrian Mundvila. They're all previous games athletes who are competing this year. Enrique as well. And then a couple who've been a fringe as well, Alex Gatoulis and Agnol. So, I wouldn't be surprised. So there's a couple of things. I think one, if the programming shows something, we might see new faces come through who aren't even on that list. But I
Mhm.
also wouldn't be surprised to see any of those names qualify to this year's games.
Okay, so this might be an even, riskier question, but if some of those athletes break through to the games, who do you think will be phased out from the games?
Oh, so I think we start to look. So there are a few athletes like Bronislav, for example, who is very strong, very good at certain things. So depending on that programming shift, might move
Mm,
away. Michael, we saw go through. It was his first year, so again, we don't know him as much of an athlete. So maybe there are some holes there. But I think that the athletes who aren't necessarily as well rounded will be the higher risk. We don't know if this is going to be like a strength bias, a conditioning bias, a gymnastic bias in the programming, and that will really dictate who goes through. Like if it happens to be more conditioning and gymnastics focused, then someone like Colin, we might even see him close to the podium. Whereas when those strength numbers come in and something gets really heavy, and if it happens to be biased towards that, we will probably see him like struggling to qualify a bit more.
mm. And then taking a look at the women's field, first, what are your thoughts around the notion that the men's field is actually deeper than the women's field in Europe this year?
I'm not sure it's like I mean, so we have had like Catherine's obviously now not in Europe, and
Mhm,
he's pregnant. So those are a couple of our big name European females who aren't there. But again, like we look at the European female side, and we're like, one of the European females who probably wasn't on anyone's list just won the Open.
mhm.
So I think that there is still a lot of depth on the female side. That even qualifying for quarterfinals in Europe is going to be very hard. There's probably a lot of there's definitely going to be European athletes that could be competing at the games that won't be there and could have got through in different regions with the same level of fitness.
How competitive is it going to be for those final spots once we get to semifinals? Do you foresee it being a situation where it's going to come down to seconds that separate people from punching a ticket to the games?
Yeah, the for example, when we had say five athletes go through, it was tight. What will
Mhm,
probably happen is by the last day, there'll be a few athletes who are pretty comfortable in their position of qualifying because we're having 11 or 12 athletes go through. It will be that 8 to 16, maybe 20, maybe up to 7. So that range will then be very competitive and will be separated by a few kilos, a few seconds. There'll be very small margins. I even remember there was back in 2016 with Lucas Holberg and Lucas Esslinger. Literally, the game spot was separated by fractions of a second to go through. So the level is competitive enough that those seconds will matter.
well, first we gotta get through quarterfinals, but John, thank you so much for catching up with us and giving us a good perspective from Europe. We can't wait to see how these athletes do.
Thanks for having me.